But we're here today to honor mothers and to give God thanks for this day and to celebrate that gift and to descend on those mothers in our lives to give God thanks and to show them our love. And as we leaf through the pages of history of those figures who have been significant for us, we're inspired by the influence of some of those great figures who were shaped by their parents, their mothers and their fathers. Our founder, John Wesley, was deeply influenced by his mother, Susanna. She had 17 children. And the way she raised them and ordered them and gave them an image of life in Christ. We know that, a lot of young mothers struggle these days because of all the demands on them of raising a family, and I heard an economist lecture one time that after about 1972, 73, to maintain the same standard of living that existed prior, that it required two wage earners, two workers in a family to maintain the same level. And so a lot of women went back to work, and still that's the case. And so trying to balance those things is tough. In the marketplace, we see the contribution that women make, and we're here to remember, to not forget. I'm going to share a story with you. I don't know if this story is appropriate. I read it and thought it was kind of funny, but there was an elderly man. He was in his 80s, and he was wandering down Fifth Avenue in New York City, and he was just wandering aimlessly, upset. He was crying. And a police officer saw him and approached him and said, "Sir, you look troubled and upset." He said, "Can I help you?" And the man responded, weeping with about every word. He said, "I'm so sad." He said, "I just got married." He said, "I've been alone for a long time." He said, "I just got married to a beautiful woman. She's in her 30s. This guy's in his 80s. He said, "She's beautiful and loving, and she's a wonderful cook, and she keeps house, and she takes care of me, and she never forgets to give my medicine to me, and she just looks after me and takes care of me." And the policeman commented, "But sir, it sounds magnificent, that relationship, but why are you so upset?" The man looked at the officer and said, "Because I can't remember how to get home." All right, well, maybe it wasn't that funny. Mother's Day is a time to not forget and to understand the value. And by the way, we've been kind of down deep in the weeds the last few weeks, looking at great prayers of the patriarchs, Abraham and Jacob and Moses. And I thought we would approach this a little differently, a little more narrative today. Is that okay with you? You may not understand what I mean by that, but you will here in a minute. And so on this Mother's Day, we want to look at the value of Christian home and the place that mothers have in our lives, a godly mother. And my comments are not only applicable to mothers, but also to anyone who influences children. You may be a mother, a father, a grandparent, a worker of children, with children. And we have a lot of those that volunteer here. And so you're an influence. This church is an influence in the lives of the kids who come here. And I'm going to look at these values of this godly presence using three vignettes, three stories that give mental images of what I want to share with you today, and help us understand the great responsibility that God shares with us as parents and grandparents. The first story is about a friend of mine. I first met Bob Stamps when I was a student at Oral Roberts University. I was a wing chaplain in the dorm, and Bob was the chaplain of the university. And Bob was United Methodist. He was from Virginia originally, went to school at Wheaton and Asbury Seminary, where I ultimately went to school. He's now a visiting professor at Asbury. After I left ORU, Bev and I met, got married, and we left. And Bob went on to get his doctorate at Edinburgh in worship. And in that free, charismatic environment, Bob brought liturgy and structure in a way that was just so deep and powerful. Bob married Ellen, who was Corrie ten Boom's personal assistant. You may know the story of Corrie ten Boom survived the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. And Bob's an interesting guy. He's bald-headed, he's energetic, he's passionate, and he and Ellen have 2 children. And Bob tells a story about when Ellen went out and she was running some errands and she came home, and much to her horror, she discovers that the older child, the sister, has decided to give her younger brother a haircut. And so she's cut all of his hair off, and more than that, she catches her, the daughter, shaving his head. And she just says, "What in the world are you trying to do?" And the daughter realized in the tone of her mother's voice that this was sort of a disappointing statement, that she knew that her mother wasn't pleased, and so she cried out, "I only wanted him to look like Daddy." We celebrate Mother's Day and parenthood in general. And here's the question: what would our children look like spiritually if they reflected us? What would our grandchildren look like spiritually? They resemble us, sure, biologically, physically sometimes. But what about the spiritual aspects, the moral aspects, the ethical aspects reflected from us who are parents? Paul wrote Timothy in the second epistle in chapter 1, verse 5, he says, "For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well." As far as we know, Timothy's father was a pagan, not very helpful in spiritual development. But Paul saw something in Timothy that he saw in Timothy's mother and grandmother. This presence, this DNA, spiritual DNA, that he saw in the grandmother and in the mother. And what Paul is encouraging Timothy in is these qualities that he sees in Timothy's parents and grandparents, this inner reflection of the presence of God. Paul is trying to make Timothy not only aware of it, but enlarge that in his life. The second story second vignette is about a famous American painter, Benjamin West. He tells a story about how he became a distinguished artist. He said when he was a young boy, and there's kind of a theme here, I guess. I was thinking about this as I was coming to church this morning and these stories, but Benjamin West's mother had returned from some errands, and he was left to watch his younger sister. And he drug his mother's oils out in brushes and a canvas, and he just made a mess of just about the whole house. And he painted a picture. He's trying to paint a picture of his sister. So when his mother came home and saw the mess, that the home was a wreck, and this painting of her daughter, Benjamin was completely surprised by his mother's response. She picked up the painting and she said, "What a beautiful painting of your sister," and gave him a kiss on the cheek and walked away. Benjamin West says that with that kiss, he became a painter because of the encouragement of his mother. We as parents, mothers, fathers, grandparents, we often see in our children what others cannot see or will not see in them, don't we? We see their value, their uniqueness, their possibility. It's often a mother's love that supplies the encouragement when a child is going through a period of self-doubt, maybe rebellion. It's that tenacious love, and maybe sometimes tough love. I remember a story. It was in a Broadway play A Raisin in the Sun. Remember that old play, Sidney Poitier? One day a mother was confronted by her daughter's growing disbelief in God, and cynically the daughter comes home and says that she didn't want to have anything to do with this idea of a living God. She didn't believe that God exists, and she believes that people can get along just fine without any kind of belief in God. And very quietly, as the outburst kind of settled down, the mother, in her quiet strength and her spiritual integrity, drew herself up and said in a serious voice to her daughter, "Now you say after me, in my mother's house there is still God." There was a pause, and then the girl, when she suddenly realized that her mother was serious and this faith that her mother had meant something and influenced the family, she slowly said, "In my mother's house there is still God." Kind of reminds me of that image of what was going on in Baltimore, and those students were let out of school and they were riding in the street, and that one mother saw her 16-year-old boy who had that hoodie up. Did you saw those images on television? And she went over and tried to reason verbally with her son, right? She grabbed that kid around the collar and was smacking him around. This is what John Wesley and Timothy and a host of other people have received from their mothers. It's this powerful force in our lives that even when we're at odds with it, crossways to it, it still is a power and an influence on us. The psalmist's image of God, he says, is like a mother comforting her child at her breast. Jesus' image of God is like a hen comforting her chicks underneath her wings. It addresses a deep need, a reassurance that as we live and love our kids this way and our grandkids, that in some way we're reflecting the very image of God. I said in that series in the Lord's Prayer, when we were looking at that first portion, Our Father, that sometimes it's difficult to see God in that way because maybe of the difficulty we've had in our childhood from the image that we've received from our parents about God. But we have the opportunity as followers of Jesus to be a presence, a witness, an encouragement, an affirmation. You may remember that old story about little Johnny in school, and he was asked, who's your favorite teacher? And he says, Mrs. Jones. And the person that was talking to little Johnny said, well, why is it Mrs. Jones? And he said, because Mrs. Jones believes that I'm better than I am. And he said, because she believes I'm better than I am, I am. I'm better. I'm better. Reminded of that other old story about the sculptor commissioned to create that marble image of Abraham Lincoln, and week after week he takes this big hunk of marble and he's chipping away, and the person that cleans the studio, that sweeps the floor and the dust and the chips, comes in every day and cleans the art studio, and as they're cleaning, looking at that piece of rock, and just first was a big piece of rock, and then all of a sudden, through the days and the weeks, this image begins to take form and shape. And one day, this person cleaning is in there when the artist, the sculptor's in there, and asks the sculptor the question, let me ask you a question. How did you know that Mr. Lincoln was in that rock? Jesus believes in us that way. He sees us, the Mr. Lincolns, and all of us in a way that we don't always see ourselves. And he believes the best in us, doesn't he? Isn't that why he gave his life for us on the cross? Even though while we were still sinners, Christ demonstrated his love for us, it says in Romans, because Christ died for us. I don't know any other thing that proclaims and declares that God sees us in our best and says he believes in me more than he should, but because he does, I'm better. The third story is a kind of a story about the kind of mother not to be. It's a true story that happened not in Bosnia or somewhere in a faraway country. It happened in our neighboring state down in Texas. This happened several years ago. It happened with a Christian mother and who was the organist of the church, who hired a hitman to kill the mother of her daughter's chief competition in the cheerleading squad. You remember that story? It seems that Wanda Holloway gave her diamond earrings as a down payment to a hitman to murder Vera Heath, who was the mother of Amber. This happened in 1989. Amber beat out Shannon, who was in a cheerleading competition. Shannon was the daughter of Wanda Holloway. And so in 89, she beat her out. And so in 1990, Shannon's mother, Wanda, passed out pencils and rulers to all the students and says, "Vote for Shonda." Well, that obviously disqualified her for the second year. And so now the third year in the running of her daughter wanting to be in the cheerleading competition, Wanda tries to permanently remove her daughter's competition by murder. The arresting detective said that the tapes tell the story because the person that she had tried to hire was an undercover detective. And this is what he said: the mother was trying to live her life through the daughter and would go to almost any length. Unfortunately for her daughter, her mother treated her as a mere symbol, not as a child of God in her own uniqueness. The mother was trying to live out her life and her dreams through her child, rather than seeing the dream that God had for her child. It's true that the home is where the heart is, but it also is true that the home can be a place of suffering, can it? Rather than a place of hope and joy. Emily Dickinson once wrote that the home is, at its best, it is a definition of God. It's a microcosm. It should be. We seldom see that because in that home, God wants us to mold and shape our kids in the image of God, right? You know, we decided when we started having kids, and before we had kids, we spent a lot of time talking. We waited about 5 years before we started having kids, about talking about how we wanted our family to be and how we were going to raise our kids, and the unique position that we were in to be a church family, a pastor and family, and sometimes living in a fishbowl. And so we tried to raise our kids in a way to allow them to make their own decisions about church and about God, but being that presence and that witness and that influence. You may remember me telling the story about the boy that Sarah was dating when she was in college down in Texas, TCU, and this kid didn't grow up in church, and I don't think he was living the way he should, and they were dating, and Sarah wanted to bring him home. It was might have been Mother's Day. And let me just say that he didn't want to come, knowing that that I was the preacher, and so they dated a while, a year or so, and it broke off, and Sarah went on. Now she's married to Dan, and they got 3 kids. But we get this weird call. I mean, this kid had been out of her life for a long time, and I get this call from this kid that she had dated in college, and he said, "Could I come to Edmond and spend the weekend with you guys?" You remember that story? I thought, sure. Yeah, come on. And so he comes on, and He comes to church with us, and before he goes back to Texas, he sits down. Well, I think we took him out to eat. He says, well, I came to say this to y'all, that I didn't want to come when Sarah said that she wanted me to come and meet you, and that's the last thing I wanted to do. But he said, you guys never judged me. You never said anything disparaging. You just kind of embraced me, pulled me in as part of the family. And he said, I can't describe to you the witness and the impact that you've had on me. He said, 6 months ago, I gave my life to Christ. I told Sarah she needed to write a book called Evangelism Through Dating. That wouldn't be appropriate now. God wants us to shape our kids in the image of God by the witness that we live. That involves the ethics, the decisions, the way we do our business, the way we treat other people, the way we treat our family. It involves our activity in church. It involves our values. Proverbs 31:25 says of motherhood, strength and beauty and dignity are her clothing. It might be that the hand that rocks the cradle are the hands that shape the world. That was true for John Wesley. Abraham Lincoln once said, no child is poor who has a godly mother. Webster's Dictionary of Mother, the New World Dictionary, says this: it's that which gives birth to something. It's the origin or the source of something, or nurtures in the manner of a mother, or has the quality of a mother. I'm going to say in that story about that young man from TCU, Doak, who gave his life to Christ, in one sense, the influence of us was an influence of a godly parent. Mothers are those who reflect the qualities and the heart of God and the home. The heart. We all would be a problem. You know, we all have bodies, and we're thankful that we have bodies, but what good would bodies be without a heart? It keeps us alive and keeps us well. And in Genesis, God saw in his creation of humankind that it was not good for man to live alone, and he created a helpmate. He said it's not good. And so he created woman. And so in these three stories, I hope we see these images that are important, that God may have a desire for us to reflect in the way we treat our kids and our grandkids. This reflection that they have of the way we live, like Bob Stamps' kids, wanting her brother to look like her daddy. May our children see a healthy, happy, and hopeful Christ and a full encouragement from us, like Benjamin West saw in his mother when she came in and saw the mess and the picture that he tried to paint of his sister, and picked it up and told him how beautiful the picture was and gave him a kiss. That was an affirmation that made him who he became. And may our children never see the selfish ambition and manipulative actions that sometimes we take as parents to try to get our kids, manipulate them to be something that maybe they don't want to be or not ready to be. The final thing this morning is remember that God is our greatest cheerleader. I want to wish you a happy Mother's Day today, all of you. And there is communion at each corner of the worship center, and I want you to respond and come and give thanks for that gift of life that your mothers have given you. Let's stand and continue our worship as we come and pray.